Hello and welcome to this short video. My name is Professor Phil Newton, and in this video we're going to do a very basic introduction to learning and memory. What I hope you're able to do by the end of this short video then is just to be able to describe the main types of memory in terms of the nature of the memory, the thing that we are remembering. At the very end we'll talk briefly about a slightly different approach to memory, and that's the amount of time that we remember things for. And they're both related, as you'll see. Most of what we're going to focus on, though, as I said, is the five main types of memory. And we're going to talk a little bit about the functional neuroanatomy of that. Very basically, where are certain types of memory stored? You'll see the inverted commas around that. It's a very basic introduction that we're going to give here. Learning and memory is quite a complex topic. To be completely honest, we don't fully understand it, even after many decades of research. But we've got a basic approach and understanding, and that's what we're going to cover here. So we'll start with memory. We can first of all classify it into two major types: explicit and implicit. Explicit memory is what we think of when we think of memory, when we think of remembering or memorizing something. It is declarative, it's conscious and deliberate. It's often called declarative memory, and one of the features of the literature on learning and memory is that it often has multiple bits of different terminology. So declarative and explicit memory are more or less the same thing. Implicit memory or non-declarative memory is unconscious and automatic. It's the sort of things that you remember, but without necessarily being conscious that you remember them. If we split that explicit up, it comes into two different flavors: semantic and episodic. Semantic memory is knowing facts, and this is really the sort of thing that we think of when we think of memorizing something. I'll show you some examples in a second. That contrasts within explicit memory with episodic memory. This is the recalling of experiences. So if I give you some examples of explicit or declarative memories split into semantic and episodic. Semantic is knowing something. Episodic memory is recalling something. Semantic is the sort of thing we think of as facts for specific details, whereas episodic memory is the recollection of experiences. So semantic is knowing what a birthday is. Episodic might be recalling the experience of a particular birthday that you had. A semantic memory might be knowing what a house is to describe what the key features of it are. An episodic memory might be the memory of your house. A semantic memory is knowing that Paris is the capital of France. An episodic memory might be recalling a trip that you made to Paris a few years ago. These types of memory are interrelated. The anatomy of them is very similar, as I'll show you in a second, but we do think of them, at least from a psychological perspective, as different constructs. Okay, on then to implicit memory, and we can break this down into three major types. The first is procedural memory. This is the memory for habits and skills. We often give as an example of procedural memory things like riding a bike or knitting or something like that. That does overlap a little bit though then with motor memory. Motor memory is the memory for how to perform a certain motor action and also how to coordinate that action, which is actually quite a complicated thing and requires quite a lot of neurological processing power. And then there's emotional memory. The sort of thing we think of as arising through classical conditioning, particularly through memories of things that make us afraid or make us happy, give us a sense of how we feel about something. If we go then through the anatomy, we largely think of explicit memories as being stored in the hippocampus. I'll just show you a picture of the hippocampus in animation, let it play through for a second. You can see there's two hemispheric representations of the hippocampus, and it has this sort of horn-like structure, which is part of how it gets its name. It's supposed to resemble a seahorse, and a seahorse, the word hippocampus means seahorse in certain languages, certain classical languages. What does the hippocampus do? It is the storage site for declarative and explicit memory. It's also really important for spatial memory, which we're not going to talk about too much more in this video. Hippocampus tells you whereabouts you are in the world. What's up, down, left and right, and so on. The hippocampus is often lost early in Alzheimer's disease, and you could probably figure that out for yourself, knowing that it's important for memories of facts and experiences, and also for spatial memory. And some of the early hallmarks of people who appear to be suffering from Alzheimer's disease is they often get lost, or they forget where they've put things, and they often forget people's names and so on. These are the sorts of memories that are lost early in Alzheimer's, and that's because, unfortunately, the hippocampus is starting to, as well, to be lost itself. It's starting to break down. Cells are starting to die there. Hippocampus is also one of the few sites of neurogenesis in the adult nervous system. That is, means that new neurons are born in the hippocampus. They migrate then to other sites, but the genesis of them, the place where they are made, if you like, is in the hippocampus. Because this is an introductory video, we're talking about the hippocampus as a singular entity, but it is composed of multiple different subregions, many of which overlap and interact with each other in a sort of rolled layer structure. We could talk about those in other videos and elsewhere, but for the purposes of today, we just need to know that it has multiple subregions and they do slightly different things. Okay, going back to our model then of the 5 different types of memory, we'll go now to talk about procedural memory. Procedural memory largely lives in the striatum, and again I'll show you an animation and just let it play through. Again, you can see there are basically 2 of them, and again that they're quite deep in the brain and they have this curved structure. The striatum, as we've said, is important for procedural memory, and just like the hippocampus, there are multiple different subregions of the striatum that do slightly different things. There are regions of the striatum that are important for motivation and reward, that's biological reward, and then reinforcement learning, learning about the value of things. And we'll talk about those in another video when we talk about the mesolimbic dopamine system. The striatum is also important for motor responses to the above. There are regions of the striatum that are largely motor in nature, that they contribute to movements, they initiate movements and control movements in response in large part to some of these goal-directed behaviors. And as I've said already, there are multiple subregions to the striatum, and again, we'll cover those elsewhere. On then to motor memory. Motor memory largely lives in the motor system. Lots of the motor system for voluntary movements lives in the cortex, the outer surface of the brain in particular, the frontal cortex, towards the back of the frontal cortex, the primary motor cortex, and then regions anterior to that, which contain the memory for how to perform certain movements and then coordinate and plan them. We talked about the cortex in another video, so I'm not going to cover it again here. I will, though, talk briefly about another important component of the motor system, and that's the cerebellum. Again, I'll just let this play through. You can see that cerebellum occupies quite a large volume of space at the back of the skull there. The cerebellum we've talked about in much more detail in another video, so I'm not going to go through it in great detail. Just to remind you of its key function within the motor system. So as I said, the motor cortex and supplementary and premotor areas up in the frontal cortex, they're responsible for planning and coordinating motor movements. There's input from the striatum to initiate those movements and to coordinate them in an ongoing way to an extent. And those commands, those motor commands, are then sent down the spinal cord to the muscles, which are asked to do what it is that the motor cortex wants them to do. Muscles will do their best, but obviously there's lots of factors that influence whether or not a movement accurately represents the desired command. And then so these motor regions get a lot of sensory feedback from the muscles about where they have actually ended up in space and in relative to each other. There's obviously a mismatch quite often between what the muscles actually end up doing and what they were supposed to do in terms of the motor cortex. You just think about kicking a football, for example, or engaging in some other complex motor action. What we want to do and what our muscles can do are often not quite the same thing. What the cerebellum does is it monitors for mismatches between what the muscles actually do and what they were supposed to do according to the commands that came down from the motor cortex. It makes real-time corrections to differences between those two things to try and make sure the next movement becomes more accurate. So when we're doing some sort of complex, rapid and ongoing movement, like me speaking right now, or if we're walking or riding a bike, the cerebellum is very important for keeping that coordinated in a very rapid, real-time way. Okay, the final region we're going to talk about then is emotional memory, and that lives in the limbic system. Again, the limbic system has been a subject of a video all by itself, just like the cerebellum. And it's just a reminder that motor memory lives in the motor system. Let me show you briefly the limbic system. Here it is. It's on the medial surface here of the brain in red. And there are lots of regions that come together to form the limbic system. They include the amygdala, the cingulate, the hypothalamus, septum, hippocampus, and more. As we covered in the other video, which is much more detailed about the role of the limbic system, very simply what the limbic system does is it tells us how we feel about something. It's important for storing, processing, and contributing emotional memory when we're processing memory. So when we're responding to new incoming sensory information, there are regions of the cortex that tell us where it's coming from, what it is, and decide what to do about it, as we've covered elsewhere when we talked about the cortex. The limbic system tells us how we feel about that. It tells us what our emotional memory is that's associated with that thing that we're seeing. Okay, The final thing we want to talk about then is just to go back to how memories get to be memories in the first place. We've talked about where they're stored, but how did they get into that storage site in the first place? What we're going to talk about then is the distinction between memory in terms of the amount of time that we remember things for. All of these types of memory that we've talked of can be thought about really as long-term memories. The fact that they are memories means that they have been encoded and stored in various regions of our nervous system. In order to get to long-term memory, they have to pass through a couple of phases to begin with. So memory starts out as short-term memory, which is really just sensory processing. So your auditory system is at the moment processing the fact that there are sound waves coming through whatever device it is you're listening to, traveling through the air and being processed by the hair cells in your ear. Your visual system is processing the visual information that's coming from the slides. We're able to process a huge amount of sensory information at any one time, but we're not really aware of that. If we end up learning what it is that we're processing, then it can end up in long-term memory, and depending upon the type of memory it is will depend upon where it's stored, as you saw in the previous slides. In order to get from this sensory processing domain into long-term memory, information content learning has to go through working memory. Working memory is the bottleneck in between those two things. So we process sensory information. If we pay attention to it, it ends up in working memory. And what working memory does, very simplistically, is it has a look in long-term memory for similar prior knowledge. Where have I seen this before? It talks to the limbic system to work out how I feel about that, and so on. If we do eventually learn something, then as I said, it ends up as a long-term memory. And part of the process of that learning is the process of retrieval, retrieving our prior knowledge, feelings, and experiences about the particular thing that it is we're trying to learn. And we've covered retrieval elsewhere when we talked about retrieval practice. The main message that I want to reiterate here, as we have done in those retrieval practice and other videos, is that working memory itself is fundamentally important for learning, but as you will see from this terrible animation, it is incredibly limited in its capacity. Psychologists talk about working memory having a capacity of between 4 to 7 chunks of information. Now, a chunk can vary in size depending upon where it's come from. If it's been retrieved from our long-term memory and we know a lot about something, then a single chunk can actually constitute a lot of content or a lot of learning. But it's still very limited in its capacity when compared to, say, long-term memory. Working memory lives here. Let me pause for a second and just let this play through. You can see the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex highlighted in red. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, also Brodmann area 46, so those two things don't overlap completely, but they do more or less for the purposes of our video. That's more or less where working memory lives. These are the regions that are doing the retrieving and the processing. Okay, let's have a summary then of everything we've covered. There are 5 major types of long-term memory. We can break those down into explicit and implicit. Within explicit memories, we have semantic and episodic, and they live in the hippocampus. Implicit memories are broken down then into the other 3 types. There is procedural memory for habits and so on. Those live in the striatum. Motor memories live in the cortical motor areas and the cerebellum. And then emotional memories, which reside in the limbic system. To get into long-term memory, we have to get through working memory first. That lives in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, Brodmann area 46, and that has a very limited capacity. Okay, that's it for this video. Any questions, please do send me an email, and I'll see you in another video. Bye-bye.